Recording in
Right. So, okay. So, welcome to Debate 101. I'm basically the person that's in charge of giving you some brief explanation regarding to how you're going to do your assessment. So, for this semester in particular, if you're taking chemistry, you'll be doing an assessment where you are asked to debate. Therefore, in this workshop, I'll be basically like telling you like the general things regarding it. And don't worry, I'll release the slide along with the video so that you could refer like what are the things that's been discussed from the workshop itself. So what I'm basically gonna do is a simple introduction of what debate is, which is called Debate 101, which we move on towards the first slide. So what actually counts as a debate? So technically speaking, in general term, a debate is usually a formal discussion regarding a specific topic, ranging from basically anything. Which means in this context, you guys are debating regarding chemistry, which is like mainly part of your assessment. So it happens because there is a problem that needs to be that needs a solution, which means the topics that you guys receive, that you guys are going to be debating it, there's always going to be specific solution, specific problems that you are required to have a solution. Which is why, like the saying goes of like, when there's an issue, there's always a debate. So, what are the solutions for it? So, this is where you try to argue whether or not which side is able to give a good solution. So, between government and opposition, this is where like both sides were trying to argue and to see who is correct and who is basically like, no, who is more like correct compared towards the others. And secondly, always that by the end of the debate, you always have to ensure towards the judges as to why like your solution is better compared towards your opponent. All right. So the format there you are using is basically what we call Asian parliamentary format, or in short term, is AP format. So on proposition, there's two sides for like this debate, which is like one, proposition, and two is opposition. So in simpler term, proposition agrees to the motion while opposition opposes to the motion. Usually for this format in particular, there's usually just like three people in one team. However, that like I've taken note that like I was informed over the fact that like in one team there's gonna be four people. Therefore, it's okay because it doesn't really disrupt regarding towards like how the debate is gonna go on. Just that like the way how things are gonna go is gonna be a bit different compared towards the usual debate that like I used to like do for that I used to like compete and then like tell people to how it does it look like. So in each role, in each sides, both sides has similar roles, just that the naming is different. So on proposition, we have the prime minister, while opposition, we have leader of opposition, who are basically both are the first speaker for both sides. For the second speaker, deputy prime minister for proposition, deputy leader of opposition for DLO. And then thirdly is what we call whip speaker, either a government or opposition whip. And last of the role for speaker roles in general is reply. So government has their own reply and opposition also has their own reply. So how does like the debate usually goes like during the round? So if you could see here, this is like the order of who are supposed to speak during the debate itself. It started off from prime minister to leader of opposition, and it zigzags to DPM, DLO, government whip, and opposition whip. So by the time it reaches towards reply speeches, it starts with opposition reply, and the debate ends with like government reply. So as a recap, prime minister goes first, LO second, then it goes back to DPM, and then it goes back to DLO, goes back to government whip, goes back to opposition whip, opposition reply, and lastly, it goes towards government reply to wrap up the debate as a whole. So what we are basically expecting in terms of like the limit of speeches is that 7 minutes is the maximum speeches for first speaker, second speaker, and third speaker for both sides, while 4 minutes is the maximum speeches for reply speeches come from both sides. More than that, we usually don't really take note of what you are talking about after the 7 minutes because it's considerably unfair as the other teams are able to abide with like within that 7 minutes while your team exceeds it. So yeah. All right. So as we already know, to boil down in terms of like speaker roles, if you don't get the prime minister and leader of opposition, that you just have to remember there's only four roles for almost every team, which is the first speaker, the second speaker, the third speaker, and lastly is the reply speaker. So moving on towards the first speaker. So one thing to keep note is that the main role of the first speaker is to set up the case for the team. By case means what are you guys are trying to argue. Secondly is to define what are the like to define basically like giving definitions or some context of what the debate is actually about. Thirdly is basically that like you trying to basically push all of your necessary material, which is like arguments or like anything that can like enhance or like further explain and prove why your team is basically like correct and why the motion should be proposed. So first speaker, they carry the biggest responsibility of all because if the case that is presented by the team doesn't satisfy the motion, it means they have screwed the debate and your team is basically like screwed. Which means in a more simple context is that your team debated the motion wrongly and it's you guys are debating out of topic, which is something that not all first speaker or any team wanted to have. Secondly, second note is that the case and materials are basically the backbone of your team. So things regarding towards like characterization, like you giving definitions towards like the topic of the debate, as well as you providing the argument as to why you support or do not support the motion, all what you gave are basically the backbone of your team. So second speaker and third speaker are basically forbidden to create cases out of nowhere. What this basically looks like is not about that second speaker cannot do new arguments. It's more on like second speaker cannot come up with a different case from what the first speaker has provided. Basically, like if first speaker says A is correct, then second speaker cannot say A is wrong, and that's you're just making another new case, which is totally unfair for their team. All right. So this is something that we call structure. Basically, that like what are the formats of like a first speaker speech. So the first thing that a first speaker should do is what something that we call rebuttals. So rebuttals is only something done for a leader of opposition. So which means if you're the first speaker for opposition, you have to start your speech with a rebuttal, which basically means you're trying to disprove of like the materials or like any arguments that is being provided by your opponents with some explanation. So secondly, we're moving on towards like the general thing of like what a first speaker should do. Firstly is setup, which is like basically that you're trying to do some context of what the motion is about. So try to determine the stance or burden of the team, or in simpler manner, the objective of what your team wanted to prove and to achieve by the end of the debate. Secondly, is the most important thing that every first speaker should do is to always characterize the debate, which means bringing some context of what the debate is about from your side. So a question that you can try to ask yourself is basically, what does your team case looks like and what you are trying to basically show towards the judges that you guys are trying to argue about. Thirdly, is something that we call world building. So world building is something basically that like you're trying to paint a picture of what you're trying to like contextualize of the debate. So as the expression goes, is that you're trying to provide context to what are the things that is being that needs to be debated. So let's say something regarding towards like something regarding towards like the periodic table. So like in as first speaker, you need to tell the judges that like what is a periodic table and what are the uses of the periodic table in order to make the judges understand why periodic tables in general is important that you guys should be arguing about and what is a clear idea the function and uses of periodic table from the get-go. So these contexts of like what you're trying to debate from the motion that has been given or what we call topics by your lecturer is something that needs to be explained on, or else the judge will be confused and basically like don't know how they're gonna judge or like basically like your case in general is quite unclear. So next is arguments. So usually my recommendation is that first speaker always do two sets of argument, which is consists of the main topic, the explanation, and why the argument itself is important to debate. So argument is usually the backbone of what you're trying to prove on, and usually how you try to like prove why you are like right compared towards the others is more on like to your arguments. Okay, next move on towards second speaker. So the second speaker is what we call a much more flexible speaker. So usually for a second speaker, their main role is to firstly add on to the first speaker. So sometimes first speaker cannot really do everything. Therefore, it's the responsibility of the second speaker to basically back the first speaker up and try to basically fill in the holes that the first speaker leave from their speech. Secondly, is always like doing some rebuttals, basically like telling the judges why certain arguments that's being or analysis provided by your first speaker, provided by your opponent is ultimately wrong with like some justification behind it. Lastly, and is the most important thing in like almost every debate, which is compare. So constantly try to compare why your team's case is better compared to the opponent. So the reason why I say that like second speaker in general is the most flexible speaker because they can either attack the opponent or defend the team's material depending on the situation. So usually they are considered like the most flexible speaker of all because they can do like either things. So their speech in general for second speaker should provide more clarity in terms of explanation of the team's case. And when they attack the opponent, it should be direct. So you cannot really beat around the bush of saying like things are like somewhat not direct. Therefore, like being direct is like the most better way on how you're able to attack your opponent's case and how you're able to like give more clarity on what arguments that they gave is ultimately wrong. So in terms of second speaker structure, firstly on rebuttals. Rebuttals is the most important thing of what every second speaker should do, which is basically that like trying to prove why the things that you said by your opponent is wrong. Next is move on towards like one piece of argument or like any arguments. The format is basically the same as how a first speaker should do, which consists of main topic, explanations, and the importance to the debate. And lastly, this is where second speaker differentiate from first speaker, which is comparative analysis. So when it comes to say doing comparative analysis, what do I mean is basically that like you're trying to compare why your team is better than the others. So a few things that like what you can try to ask yourself and answer is that what did your team do right? Secondly, why your opponent is bad compared to you? And lastly, what is the best situation for government and the worst situation for you? So if you are able to say that like even if at the best situation of government, they still lose out compared towards your worst situation. So try to like be comparative in almost every aspect of what you're trying to argue about, because like the more comparative you are, the more points are being given to you and the more likelihood why you should win the debate. Next is third speaker. So third speaker, or what we call with speaker, has a very direct and easy role in my opinion, because it's like a role of a third speaker is mainly to just destroy the opponent's case. So what do we mean by destroying? So destroying in this context is basically that like you're trying to say to the judges why everything that's been said by your opponent is ultimately wrong, with of course some justification. Secondly, is you trying to defend of your own team's case. Basically, like why your team's case is ultimately right and true, despite what your opponent is saying. And lastly, which is like what separates the word speaker compared towards first and second, is to provide a conclusion for your team on a more biased way, which is basically that like, oh, we basically win this debate due to reason XYZ, as compared towards opposition due to reasons XYZ. So why would speaker oftentimes rely mostly on what the first speaker and second speaker said in their speeches. So in the case the third speaker adds an argument or gives a new definition within their clarification, it will be considered to be new material and it will not be included in the adjudication paper. So what this basically means, you say something that's new and the judges will just ignore it and either penalize you for saying new things within your speeches. So be very, very careful when it comes to doing rebuttals of not adding new material. So for in terms of how to do with like third speaker in general, the structure is ultimately like simple. So the first part is always doing rebuttals, where you're trying to basically try to present like the technical aspects of the case that is presented by your opponent and why is it like strategically wrong or like ultimately the sense of direction is ultimately wrong come from your opponent. Secondly, things are that considered to be miscellaneous. So what do I mean by things are considered miscellaneous? These are basically like things that are like you are not able to compare and it's just something that just exists differently from the things that you can compare on. So comparatives. So be as with speaker, in order to provide a conclusion, you always have to constantly compare towards why your team's case is better compared towards your opponent. So few things that you can try to do is to find out what both sides agreed on solving, but disagree on which method to use. Because like keep in mind, in almost every like problem, despite both sides having a same like agreed that it should be solved, it should be solved. But then like in terms of how the method in order to solve the issue itself will be like ultimately different. So always try to prove why your solution is better and why your opponent's solution is worse. And then like secondly is basically that like arguments that can be grouped together. What this basically means things like long term versus short term, or anything that's like kind of like somewhat clashing towards one another are things that you could try to compare easily. So yeah, basically like from the example itself, short term versus long term. All right. Now we move on towards the last speaker for the speeches, which is reply speeches. So generally, a reply speech kind of summarizes like the whole debate itself, like and then proving like why your team ultimately wins the debate. So unlike other speaker roles that have like a 7 or 8 minute speech, the reply speeches only have like 4 minutes in general. So after 4 minutes, usually the judges wouldn't take note and try to ignore what you said and somewhat penalize you for it. So the reply speeches that act as a final statement come from the bench, basically summarizing the whole debate and try to assure why the judge should give them the win. So yeah, usually from the side itself, it's usually being done by first and second. But then like in this case, since there's a fourth member, so the fourth member should do the reply speeches. So basically just try to summarize everything and give justification why your team should deserve the win in the end of the day. Yeah. So in terms of structure, it's very simple. There's only two things that you need to do. If you cannot do the first part, which is what we call strategic observation, this is more on the technical part. If you are able to do it, bonus marks will be given because you are able to do it in a manner that's correct. So strategic observations basically means like how bad in terms of strategy that your opponent did and how well in terms of strategy that you are able to do when you are trying to approach and debate the motion itself. So three questions that you can try to ask yourself. Firstly, what do you think about your opponent's strategy? Is it bad? Is it good? What's the reason? Secondly, how is your team unique compared towards everyone in the debate? So the more unique you are, the more likelihood why you should win the debate and why like your team's case is much more better than your opponent. And lastly, basically like telling us what's the point of the debate. Because like sometimes it's very common where we see that like whenever you are debating a topic, people always throw in like many things, like literally many things. Some things are relevant, and some things are not really considered relevant to debate. Therefore, it's your job as the reply speaker to basically like tell the judges which one is relevant and important and which one is not, so that like your team could have an edge in terms of winning the debate itself. And lastly, is basically like doing like comparatives. It's basically the same as what that I already said for like the third speaker, which is that find what both sides agreed on solving, but try to disagree on which method to use. So proving your solution why they're better and why your opponent is worse, and basically like do some things like group like arguments that can be grouped together, like short term versus long term. So that's basically it. All right. So this is basically like another thing, what we call points of information, where during the time where POIs are allowed to be done, which is only by the first, second, and during the first, second, and third speeches, after the first minute mark, until the 6 minute mark. So something that we call points of information, where you use this time to ask question or give statement towards your opponent. So the strategy is that you either ask for some clarification or give out some statement to try to enhance your team's stance or case, or two, something that you just wanted to annoy them or disrupt the flow of their speech, which is also quite helpful in terms of like giving you guys an edge on how you guys are able to win. So as I mentioned, this can only be done during first to third speaker's speech, from the first minute mark till the 6 minute mark of the speech, and it cannot be done during reply speeches. Because reply speeches, main responsibility is to summarize. So to recap, only can be done during first to third speaker on the first minute to the 6 minute mark. And lastly, it cannot be done for reply speeches in general. Right. So what you see here is basically like how we're gonna mark you in terms of like the debate itself. Like basically like how we're gonna give you marks of your respective speeches. So there's gonna be 40% for content, which is more towards your testing your chemistry knowledge. 40% is more towards your style, regarding towards like how clear you are able to speak, and basically that like how are you like basically like how good you are at presenting your speech. And lastly, for the 20% is more towards your strategy, like your general approach on how you're gonna debate the motion itself. That's 20% of your overall like speech itself. So in total, if we total up everything, the total like marks in general is 100. So 40% is more about your chemistry knowledge, while another 40% is more about like how clear and able you are presenting this knowledge during your speech, and how well you're able to debate and persuade the jurors of like why you are basically like winning the debate compared to the opponent. And then like lastly, 20% is more towards your is more towards your ability of how you're able to like approach the debate itself, which is something that's like usually the judges will like know from the get-go. So yeah, so based on the rubric itself, is basically just like in terms of like how things are. So I believe this is basically the end of the workshop. So hope it clears out some like confusion on how you guys are able to debate. And for any further question, you are free to regarding like how to debate, basically the technicalities on how you're able to debate, how to debate in general. You are free to contact me through my WhatsApp or through my email or through like your respective lecturer regarding it. Anything regarding those like chemistry, yeah, I cannot give you anything because it's not part of like what I'm supposed to give some clarification towards you. And yeah, it's basically like it's not something that I'm supposed to answer to you. So that's all for me. Best of luck in your chemistry assessment. So that's all for me. Thank you.